just rammed into the wall. Well, hello. Hope you're doing well. It's been a while since I've read. I don't know if it's been a while since you've listened, but we're on to chapter 18. Rebecca represents the family. So she had just gone home and now she's back. She had offered her place to Hannah, but trying to give her a chance. But Hannah said she didn't want to come. So let's see what happens with Rebecca now. Rebecca represents the family. There was another milestone. It was more than that. It was an event that made a deep impression in several quarters and left a wake of smaller events in its train. This was the coming to Riverboro of the Reverend Amos Birch and wife, returned missionaries from Syria. The Aid Society had called its meeting a certain Wednesday in March of the year in which Rebecca ended her Riverboro school days and began her studies at Wareham. It was a raw, blustering day, snow on the ground, and a look in the sky of more to follow. Both Miranda and Jane had taken cold and decided that they could not leave the house in such weather, and this deflection from the path of duty worried Miranda, since she was an officer of the society. After making the breakfast table sufficiently uncomfortable and wishing plaintively that Jane wouldn't always insist on being sick at the same time she was, she decided that Rebecca must go to the meeting in their stead. "You'll be better than nobody, Rebecca," she said flatteringly. "Your Aunt Jane shall write an excuse from afternoon school for you. You can wear your rubber boots and come home by the way of the meetin' house. This Mr. Birch, if I remember right, used to know your grandfather Sawyer, and stayed here once when he was candidatin'. He'll maybe look for us there, and you must just go and represent the family and give him our respects. Be careful how you behave. Bow your head in prayer, sing all the hymns, but not too loud and bold. Ask after Miss Strout's boy, tell everybody what awful colds we've got, if you see a good chance. Take your pocket handkerchief and wipe the dust off the melodeon before the meeting begins, and get 25 cents out of the sitting room matchbox in case there should be a collection." Rebecca willingly assented. Anything interested her, even a village missionary meeting, and the idea of representing the family was rather intoxicating. The service was held in the Sunday school room, and although the Reverend Mr. Birch was on the platform when Rebecca entered, there were only a dozen persons present. Feeling a little shy and considerably too young for this assemblage, Rebecca sought the shelter of a friendly face, and seeing Mrs. Robinson on one of the side seats near the front, she walked up the aisle and sat beside her. "Both my aunts have bad colds," she said softly, "and sent me to represent the family." "That's Mrs. Birch on the platform with her husband," whispered Mrs. Robinson. "She's awful tanned up, ain't she? If you're going to save souls, seems like you have to part with your complexion. Eudoxie Morton ain't come yet. I hope to the land she will, or Miss Deacon Milliken'll pitch the tunes where we can't reach 'em with a ladder. Can you pitch before she gets her breath and clears her throat?" Mrs. Birch was a slim, frail little woman with dark hair, a broad, low forehead, and patient mouth. She was dressed in a well-worn black silk and looked so tired that Rebecca's heart went out to her. "They're poor as Job's turkey," whispered Mrs. Robinson, "but if you give 'em anything, they'd turn right around and give it to the heathen. His congregation up to Parsonfield clubbed together and give him that gold watch he carries. I suppose he'd a handed that over too, only heathens always tell time by the sun and don't need watches. Eudoxie ain't comin' now, for Massy's sake. Rebecca, do get ahead of Miss Deacon Milliken and pitch real low." The meeting began with prayer, and then the Reverend Mr. Birch announced, to the tune of Minden, "Church of our God, I arise and shine, bright with the beams of truth divine. Then shall thy radiance stream afar, wide as the heathen nations are. Gentiles and kings thy light shall view, and shall admire and love thee too. They come like clouds across the sky, as doves that to their windows fly. "Is there any one present who will assist us at the instrument?" he asked unexpectedly. Everybody looked at everybody else, and nobody moved. Then there came a voice out of a far corner saying informally, "Rebecca, why don't you?" It was Mrs. Cobb. Rebecca could have played Mendon in the dark, so she went to the melodeon, that must be it, and did so without any ado, no member of her family being present to give her self-consciousness. The melodeon, I think we looked that up before, didn't we? Is that like a piano? Let's see. Let me double check that. A small accordion of German origin, played especially by folk musicians. Or that's the first definition. Second definition, I think this is the one we want. A small organ popular in the 19th century, similar to the harmonium. I think that's the one we want. Sounds like a small organ, not a small accordion. All right. So she played the melodeon. The talk that ensued was much the usual sort of thing. Mr. Birch made impassioned appeals for the spreading of the gospel, and added his entreaties that all who were prevented from visiting in person the peoples who sat in the darkness should contribute liberally to the support of others who could. But he did more than this. He was a pleasant, earnest speaker, and he interwove his discourse with stories of life in a foreign land, of the manners, the customs, the speech, the point of view, even giving glimpses of the daily round, the common task of his own household, the work of his devoted helpmate, and their little group of children, all born under Syrian skies. Rebecca sat entranced, having been given the key of another world. Riverboro had faded, the Sunday school room with Mrs. Robinson's red plaid shawl, and Deacon Milliken's wig on crooked, the bare benches and torn hymn books, the hanging texts and maps were no longer visible, and she saw blue skies and burning stars, white turbans and gay colors. Mr. Birch had not said so, but perhaps there were mosques and temples and minarets and date palms. What stories they must know, those children born under Syrian skies. Then she was called upon to play "Jesus Shall Reign Where'er the Sun." The contribution box was passed, and Mr. Birch prayed. As he opened his eyes and gave out the last hymn, he looked at the handful of people, at the scattered pennies and dimes in the contribution box, and reflected that his mission was not only to gather funds for the building of his church, but to keep alive in all these remote and lonely neighborhoods that love for the cause which was its only hope in the years to come. "If any of the sisters will provide entertainment," he said, "Mrs. Birch and I will remain among you tonight and tomorrow. In that event, we could hold a parlor meeting. My wife and one of my children would wear the native costume. We would display some specimens of Syrian handiwork and give an account of our educational methods with the children." These informal parlor meetings, admitting of questions or conversation, are often the means of interesting those not commonly found at church services. So I repeat, if any member of the congregation desires it and offers her hospitality, we will gladly stay and tell you more of the Lord's work. A pall of silence settled over the little assembly. There were some cogent reasons why every sister there was disinclined for company. Some had no spare room. Some had a larder less well stocked than usual. Some had sickness in the family. Some were unequally yoked together with unbelievers who disliked strange ministers. Mrs. Birch's thin hands fingered her black silk nervously. Would no one speak, thought Rebecca, her heart fluttering with sympathy. Mrs. Robinson leaned over and whispered significantly, "The missionaries always used to be entertained at the brick house. Your grandfather never would have let them sleep anywhere else when he was alive." She meant this for a stab at Miss Miranda's parsimony. It's one of those two. Not sure where the emphasis goes. Hold on. parsimony, parsimony, which means an extreme unwillingness to spend money or use resources. Ah, yes, that fits Miss Miranda, doesn't it? She's a little stingy. She meant this for a stab at Miss Miranda's parsimony, remembering the 4 spare chambers closed from January to December. But Rebecca thought it was intended as a suggestion, because Rebecca is far from being stingy. She loves everything, everyone, generous, isn't she? Okay, so Rebecca thought it was intended for a suggestion. If it had been a former custom, perhaps her aunts would want her to do the right thing. For what else was she representing the family? So, delighted that duty lay in so pleasant a direction, she rose from her seat and said in the pretty voice and with the quaint manner that so separated her from all the other young people in the village, "My aunts, Miss Miranda and Miss Jane Sawyer, would be very happy to have you visit them at the brick house, as the ministers always used to do when their father was alive. They sent their respects by me." The respects might have been the freedom of the city, or an equestrian statue, which, when represented in this way, and the aunts would have shuddered could they have foreseen the manner of delivery, but it was vastly impressive to the audience, who concluded that Miranda Sawyer must be making her way uncommonly fast to mansions in the skies, else what meant this abrupt change of her heart? Mr. Birch bowed courteously, accepted the invitation in the same spirit in which it was offered, and asked Brother Milliken to lead in prayer. If the eternal ear could ever tire, it would have ceased long ere to listen to Deacon Milliken, who had wafted to the throne of grace the same prayer with very slight variations for 40 years. Mrs. Perkins followed. She had several petitions at her command, good sincere ones too, but a little cut and dried, made of scripture texts laboriously woven together. Rebecca wondered why she always ended at the most peaceful seasons with the form, "Do thou be with us, God of battles, while we strive onward like Christian soldiers marching as to war." But everything sounded real to her today. She was in a devout mood, and many things Mr. Birch had said had moved her strangely. As she lifted her head, the minister looked directly at her and said, "Will our young sister close the service by leading us in prayer?" Every drop of blood in Rebecca's body seemed to stand still, and her heart almost stopped beating. Mrs. Cobb's excited breathing could be heard distinctly in the silence. There was nothing extraordinary in Mr. Birch's request. In his journeyings among country congregations, he was constantly in the habit of meeting young members who had experienced religion and joined the church when 9 or 10 years old. Rebecca was now 13. She had played the melodeon, led the singing, delivered her aunt's invitation with an air of great worldly wisdom, and he, concluding that she must be a youthful pillar of the church, called upon her with the utmost simplicity. Rebecca's plight was pathetic. How could she refuse? How could she explain she was not a member? How could she pray before all those elderly women? John Rogers at the stake hardly suffered more than this poor child for the moment as she rose to her feet, forgetting that ladies prayed sitting, while deacons stood in prayer. Her mind was a maze of pictures that the Reverend Mr. Birch had flung on the screen. She knew the conventional phraseology, of course. What New England child, accustomed to Wednesday evening meetings, does not? But her own secret prayers were different. However, she began slowly and tremulously. "Our Father, who art in heaven, thou art God in Syria just the same as in Maine. Over there today are blue skies and yellow stars and burning suns. The great trees are waving in the warm air, while here the snow lies thick under our feet. But no distance is too far for God to travel, and so he is with us here as he has with them there. And our thoughts rise to him as doves that to their windows fly. We cannot all be missionaries teaching people to be good. Some of us have not learned yet how to be good ourselves. But if thy kingdom is to come and thy will is to be done on earth as it is in heaven, everybody must try and everybody must help, those who are old and tired and those who are young and strong. The little children of whom we have heard, those born under Syrian skies, have strange and interesting work to do for thee. Some of us would like to travel in far lands and do wonderful brave things for the heathen and gently take away their idols of wood and stone. But perhaps we have to stay at home and do what is given to us to do. Sometimes even things we dislike. But that must be what it means in the hymn we sang when it talked about the sweet perfume that rises with every morning sacrifice. This is the way that God teaches us to be meek and patient, and the thought that he has willed it so should rob us of our fears and help us bear the years. Amen. Poor little ignorant, fantastic child. Her petition was simply a succession of lines from the various hymns and images the minister had used in his sermon. But she had her own way of recombining and implying these things, even of using them in a new connection, so that they had a curious effect of belonging to her. The words of some people might generally be written with a minus sign after them, the minus meaning that the personality of the speaker subtracted from them rather than added to their weight. But Rebecca's words might always have borne the plus sign. The Amen said she sat down, or presumed she sat down, on what she believed to be a bench, and there was a benediction. In a moment or two, when the room ceased spinning, she went up to Mrs. Birch, who kissed her affectionately and said, "My dear, how glad I am that we are going to stay with you. Will 5:30 be too late for us to come? It is 3 now, and we have to go to the station for our valet and for our children. We left them there, being uncertain whether we should go back or stop here." Rebecca said that 5:30 was their supper hour, and then accepted an invitation to drive home with Mrs. Cobb. Her face was flushed, and her lip quivered in a way that Aunt Sarah had learned to know, so the homeward drive was taken almost in silence. The bleak wind and Aunt Sarah's quieting presence brought her back to herself, however, and she entered the brick house cheerily. Being too full of news to wait in the side entry to take off her rubber boots, she carefully lifted a braided rug into the sitting room and stood on that while she opened her budget. "There are your shoes warming by the fire," said Aunt Jane. "Slip them right on while you talk." That's the end of that chapter. I'm going to go ahead and read the next one. It's called it's not called chapter 14. It is chapter 14, and it's called Deacon Israel's Successor. I'll be interested to see how Aunt Miranda and Aunt Jane react to Rebecca's news of guests, overnight guests at that. All right. It was a very small meeting. Aunt Miranda began. Let me start over. "It was a very small meeting, Aunt Miranda," began Rebecca, "and the missionary and his wife are lovely people, and they are coming here to stay all night and tomorrow with you. I hope you won't mind." "Coming here!" exclaimed Miranda, letting her knitting fall in her lap and taking her spectacles off, as she always did in moments of extreme excitement. "Did they invite themselves?" "No," Rebecca answered. "I had to invite them for you, but I thought you'd like to have such interesting company. It was this way." "Stop your explaining and tell me first when they'll be here. Right away." "Right away?" "No, not for 2 hours. About 5:30. Then you can explain, if you can, who gave you any authority to invite a passel of strangers to stop here overnight, when you know we ain't had any company for 20 years and don't intend to have any for another 20, or at any rate while I'm the head of the house." "Don't blame her, Miranda, till you've heard her story," said Jane. "It was in my mind right along, if we went to the meeting, some such thing might happen on account of Mr. Birch knowing father." "The meeting was a small one," began Rebecca. "I gave all your messages, and everybody was disappointed you couldn't come, for the president was there, and Mrs. Matthews took the chair, which was a pity, for the seat wasn't nearly big enough for her, and she reminded me of a line in a hymn we sang, 'Wide as the heathen nations are.' and she wore that kind of a beaver garden hat that always gets on one side. And Mr. Birch talked beautifully about the Syrian heathen, and the singing went real well, and there looked to be about 40 cents in the basket that was passed on our side, and that wouldn't save even a heathen baby, would it? Then Mr. Birch said, if any sister would offer entertainment, they would pass the night and have a parlor meeting in Riverboro tomorrow with Mrs. Birch in Syrian costume and lovely foreign things to show. Then he waited and waited, and nobody said a word. I was so mortified I didn't know what to do. And then he repeated what he said and explained why he wanted to stay, and you could see he thought it was his duty. Just then Mrs. Robinson whispered to me and said the missionaries always used to go to the brick house when grandfather was alive, and that he never would let them sleep anywhere else. I didn't know you had stopped having them, because no traveling ministers have ever been here except just for Sunday morning since I came to Riverboro, so I thought I ought to invite them, as you weren't there to do it for yourself, and you told me to represent the family. What did you do, go up and introduce yourself as folks was going out? No, I stood right up and mean. I had to, for Mr. Birch's feelings were getting hurt and nobody speaking. So I said, my aunts, Miss Miranda and Miss Jane Sawyer, would be happy to have you visit the brick house, just as the missionaries always did when their father was alive, and they sent their respects by me. Then I sat down, and Mr. Birch prayed for grandfather and called him a man of God, and thanked our Heavenly Father that his spirit was still alive in his descendants, that was you, and that the good old house where so many of the brethren had been cheered and helped, and from which so many had gone out strengthened for the fight, was still hospitably open for the stranger and wayfarer. Sometimes when the heavenly bodies are in just the right conjunction, nature seems to be the most perfect art. The word or the deed coming straight from the heart without any thought of effect seems inspired. A certain gateway in Miranda Sawyer's soul had been closed for years. Not all at once had it been done, but gradually and without her full knowledge. If Rebecca had plotted for days and with the utmost cunning, she could not have effected an entrance into that forbidden country. And now, unknown to both of them, the gate swung on its stiff and rusty hinges, and the favoring wind of opportunity opened it wider and wider as time went on. All things had worked together amazingly for the good. The memory of old days had been evoked, and the daily life of a pious and venerated father called to mind. The Sawyer name had been publicly dignified and praised. Rebecca had comported herself as the granddaughter of Deacon Israel Sawyer should, and showed conclusively that she was not all Randall, as had been supposed. Miranda was rather mollified by and pleased with the turn of events, although she did not intend to show it, or give anybody any reason to expect that this expression of hospitality was to serve for a precedent on any subsequent occasion. Well, I see you did only what you was obliged to do, Rebecca, she said, and you worded your invitation as nice as anybody could have done. I wish your Aunt Jane and me wasn't both so worthless with these colds, but it only shows the good of having a clean house with every room in order, whether open or shut, and enough victuals cooked so you can't be surprised and be belittled by anybody, whatever happens. There was half a dozen there that might have entertained the Birches as easy as not, if they hadn't been too mean or lazy. Why didn't your missionaries come right along with you? They had to go to the station for the valet and their children. Are there children? Groaned Miranda. Yes, Aunt Miranda, all born under Syrian skies. Syrian grandmother, exclaimed Miranda, and it was not a fact. How many? I didn't think to ask, but I will get 2 rooms ready, and if there are any over, I'll take 'em into my bed, said Rebecca, secretly hoping that this would be the case. Now, as you're both half sick, couldn't you trust me just once to get ready for the company? You can come up when I call, will you? I believe I will, sighed Miranda reluctantly. I'll lay down sided Jane in our bedroom and see if I can get strength to cook supper. It's 3:30. Don't you let me lay a minute past 5. I kept a good I kept a good fire in the kitchen stove. I don't know, I'm sure, why I should have baked a pot of beans in the middle of the week, but they'll come in handy. Father used to say there was nothing that went right to the spot with returned missionaries like pork and beans and brown bread. Fix up the 2 south chambers, Rebecca. Rebecca, given a free hand for the only time in her life, dashed upstairs like a whirlwind. Every room in the brick house was as neat as wax, and she had only to pull up the shades, go over the floors with a whisk broom, and dust the furniture. The aunts could hear her scurrying to and fro, beating up pillows and feather beds, flapping towels, jingling crockery, singing, meanwhile, in her clear voice, "In vain with lavish kindness the gifts of God are strown. The heathen in his blindness bows down to wood and stone." She had grown to be a handy little creature, and tasks she was capable of doing at all she did like a flash, so that when she called her aunts at 5 o'clock to pass judgment, she had accomplished wonders. There were fresh towels on bureaus and washstands. The beds were fair and smooth. The pitchers were filled, and soap and matches were laid out. Newspaper kindling and wood were in the boxes, and a large stick burned slowly in each airtight stove. "I thought I'd better just take the chill off," she explained, "as they're right from Syria. And that reminds me, I must look it up in the geography before they get here." There was nothing to disapprove, so the 2 sisters went downstairs to make some slight changes in their dress. As they pressed the parlor door, Miranda thought she heard a crackle and looked in. The shades were up. There was a cheerful blaze in the open stove in the front parlor, and a fire laid in the hearth in the back room. Rebecca's own lamp, her second Christmas present from Mr. Aloud, stood on a marble-topped table in the corner. The light that came softly through its rose-colored shade transformed the stiff and gloomy ugliness of the room into a place where one could sit and love one's neighbor. "For Massy's sake, Rebecca," called Miss Miranda up the stairs, "did you think we'd better open the parlor?" Rebecca came out on the landing, braiding her hair. "We did on Thanksgiving and Christmas, and I thought this was about as great an occasion," she said. "I moved the wax flowers off the mantelpiece so they wouldn't melt, and put the shells, the coral, and the green stuffed bird on top of the whatnot, so the children wouldn't ask to play with them. Brother Milliken's coming over to see Mr. Birch about business, and I shouldn't wonder if Brother and Sister Cobb happened in. Don't go down cellar. I'll be there in a minute to do the running." Miranda and Jane exchanged glances. "Ain't she the beatenest creature that ever was born into the world?" exclaimed Miranda. "But she can turn off work when she's got a mind to." At 5:15, everything was ready, and the neighbors, those at least who were within sight of the brick house, a prominent object in the landscape when there were no leaves on the trees, were curious almost to desperation. Shades up in both parlors, shades up in the 2 south bedrooms, and fires, if human vision was to be relied on, fires in about every room. If it had not been for the kind offices of a lady who had been at the meeting, and who charitably called in at 1 or 2 houses and explained the reason of all this preparation, there would have been no sleep in many families. The missionary party arrived promptly, and there were but 2 children, 7 or 8 having been left with the brethren in Portland to diminishing traveling expenses. Jane escorted them all upstairs, while Miranda watched the cooking of the supper. But Rebecca promptly took the 2 little girls away from the mother, divested them of their wraps, smoothed their hair, and brought them down to the kitchen to smell the beans. There was a beautiful supper, and the presence of the young people robbed it of all possible stiffness. Aunt Jane helped clear the table and put away the food, while Miranda entertained in the parlor. But Rebecca and the infant Birches washed the dishes and held high carnival in the kitchen, doing only trifling damage, breaking a cup and plate that had been cracked before, emptying a silver spoon with some dishwasher out of the back door, an act never permitted at the brick house, and putting coffee grounds in the sink, all evidence of crime having been removed by Rebecca and damages repaired in all possible cases. The 3 entered the parlor, where Mr. Cobb and Mrs. Cobb and Deacon and Mrs. Milliken had already appeared. It was such a pleasant evening. Occasionally they left the heathen in his blindness, bowing down to wood and stone, not for long, but just to give themselves and him time enough to breathe. And then the birches told strange, beautiful, marvelous things. The two smaller children sang together, and Rebecca, at the urgent request of Mrs. Birch, seated herself at the tinkling old piano and gave Wild Roved an Indian Girl bright Alpharetta with considerable spirit and style. At 8 o'clock she crossed the room, handed a palm leaf fan to her Aunt Miranda, ostensibly that she might shade her eyes from the lamplight, but it was a piece of strategy that gave her an opportunity to whisper, "How about cookies?" "Do you think it's worth while?" sibilated Mrs. Miranda in answer. "The Parkinsons always do." "All right, you know where they be." Rebecca moved quietly towards the door, and the young Birches cataracted after her as if they could not bear a second's separation. In 5 minutes they returned, the little ones bearing plates of thin caraway wafers, hearts, diamonds, and circles daintily sugared and flecked with caraway seed raised in the garden behind the house. They were a specialty of Miss Jane's, and Rebecca carried a tray with 6 tiny crystal glasses filled with dandelion wine, for which Miss Miranda had been famous in years gone by. Old Deacon Israel had always had it passed, and he had bought the glasses himself in Boston. Miranda admired them greatly, not only for their beauty, but because they held so little. Before their advent, the dandelion wine had been served in sherry glasses. As soon as these refreshments, commonly called a collation in Riverboro, had been genteelly partaken of, Rebecca looked at the clock, rose from her chair in the children's corner, and said cheerfully, "Come, time for little missionaries to be in bed." Everybody laughed at this, the big missionaries most of all, as the young people shook hands and disappeared with Rebecca. And that's the end. What a fun chapter. I remember when I was little, and your mom and I were little, your Uncle Rob was a baby, but we had some missionaries from Kenya stay with us, and it was so fun to play with them and like hear all the stories. I hadn't been to Kenya yet at that time, so later I got to go and kind of see where they grew up and see the fun animals and all that stuff, and I loved that. Was a fun memory for me to play with the kids that grew up in another country, because at that point we hadn't moved to another country. Then I think maybe the next year we moved to the Philippines because of Grandpa's being in the Air Force. But so it was fun for me to hear about another culture from them. So that kind of brings back good memories. Well, have a good day or night or morning or whatever. Bye.